Section 2.2 talks about conditional statements. Okay, a conditional is an if-then statement. Just write this down and it'll make more sense as we talk about it, but I need to get the basics down here with you. The hypothesis is the part P following the word if. The conclusion is the part Q following the word then. And this is read, if P, then Q. This is the symbolism that we use. If this thing happens, then this will always happen. Another way to say it, we don't use it as often, is P implies Q. So let's look at one, and it'll make a little more sense. Be sure you've got all this down. If P, then Q, if then, or conditional statements. So here is a conditional statement. If an animal is a poodle, then the animal is a dog. So if somebody comes up to you and says, I have a poodle, you know that they have a dog. So if an animal is a poodle, this is my hypothesis, then the animal is a dog. This is my conclusion. So if I know that the animal is a poodle, then I can conclude the animal is a dog. If then. If P, this would be our P statement, then Q. Okay, here's another one. If an angle measures 135 degrees, then the angle is obtuse. So again, if I have something, my hypothesis, that is 135 degrees, then I can conclude that it is obtuse. So if P, then Q. If my hypothesis statement is true, then my conclusion is true. All right, we're going to do a bunch of stuff with this now. So one of the things is taking a common statement and rewrite it to create a conditional statement. So copy that down, pause and give yourself a minute. So the first one, vertical angles share a vertex. This is a statement. It is not an if-then. But I can change this to make it an if-then statement. And I can change it because my hypothesis is that if I have vertical angles, then they will share a vertex. So if two angles are vertical, then they share a vertex. So taking the statement, vertical angles share a vertex, and turning it into an if-then conditional. Try it yourself with this one. The statement is dolphins are mammals. Can you rewrite this to an if-then statement? So if something is a dolphin, if an animal is a dolphin, then it is a mammal. So this is one of the tasks you're going to be working on in class. The other thing we have to talk about is the truth value of a conditional. The truth value of a conditional statement tells if it is true or false. We can have false conditionals. We could say, if an animal is a dog, then it is a poodle. Now that's not necessarily true. So that might be a false statement. So let's look at a couple of these. And I really hope you're writing all this down. I know it's a lot of writing, but if you have all these examples down in your notes, you'll have a better, easier time of doing your work. So, if a woman is Hungarian, then she is European. Think to yourself, is this true or false? If a woman is a Hungarian, are all Hungarians Europeans? So yes, this is true because Hungary is a European nation. If you live in Hungary, you also live in Europe. How about this one? If a number is divisible by 3, then it is odd. So write it down and think for a minute. Is this statement always true, or are there some false possibilities here? So hopefully you figured out that this is false. One example I gave was that 12 is divisible by 3, but it is not odd. So therefore, if a number is divisible by 3, it is not necessarily odd. We cannot say that this is a true statement. So this is a true conditional. This is a false conditional. We prove a conditional statement false by providing a counterexample, and that's what I did here. This is a counterexample. It's an example that shows that the conditional is not always true. So, state that the conditional statement is true or false. If it is false, give a counterexample. So I'm going to put two statements up, and I want you to decide if they're true or false. If they are false, then provide a counterexample. Okay, hopefully you copied everything down and made your decisions. If a month has 28 days, then it is February. Is this true or false? Probably a lot of you put true. This was a little bit of a tricky one. We could say this is false because every month has at least 28 days. It didn't say exactly. It didn't say no more than. Okay, so this one was a tricky one. So this one I put as false because every month does have 28 days. Some of them have more than that, etc. But anyway, if two angles form a linear pair, then they are supplementary. This is true. This is one of our postulates. So this is always true. Now be careful, because sometimes if we switch things around, we have a false statement. A converse is when we switch the end with the beginning. So if I had said, if two angles are supplementary, then they form a linear pair. This would be false, because I could have two supplementary angles that, although they add up to 180, they do not form a linear pair. So sometimes something is true one way, but not the other. And that's our next thing that we're going to talk about. Conditional statements can be changed by switching their order. That's what I just did a minute ago. I switched the hypothesis and the conclusion, or by stating the opposite. So it's important to get this down because you are going to need to have all of this. Give yourself plenty of room across the page. So the first example, the statement is our original conditional statement. We use the given hypothesis and the conclusion. Our example here is if measure of angle A equals 15, then angle A is acute. It's if P then Q, and written verbally as if P then Q. The first way we're going to change this up is to write the converse. You need to be pausing the video and writing this all down. The converse, we exchange the hypothesis and the conclusion. That's what I did on the last slide. So in this case, switching my hypothesis with my conclusion. So now if A is acute, then the measure of angle A equals 15. This is Q then P, or if Q then P. And you can see that now I have a false statement here. Inverse, negate both the hypothesis and the conclusion of the conditional. So I'm going back to the same order. If the measure of angle A is not 15, then angle A is not acute. And we write this as not P, then not Q. So if not P, then not Q, the opposite of each statement. Is this true or false in this example? Well, this is false, because if measure of angle A is not 15, then angle A is not acute. If it's not 15, it could still be acute. And the last is the contrapositive. Again, going back to the original, keep it in the same, we're going back to the converse. Negate both the hypothesis and the conclusion of the converse. So the contrapositive, we're switching the order and negating, or making it negative. If angle A is not acute, then the measure of angle A is not 15 degrees. Not Q, then not P. In the example I've given you, our original conditional was true. Our converse was false, because just because it's acute doesn't make it 15 degrees. Our inverse was false, and our contrapositive was true. If angle A is not acute, then it cannot be 15 degrees. Okay, so in this particular case, both my conditional and my contrapositive were true. The converse and the inverse is false. And that leads us to our next slide. Equivalent statements have the same truth value. If a statement is equivalent, we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. A conditional and its contrapositive are equivalent statements. They are either both true or both false. The converse and inverse of a statement are equivalent. They are either both true or both false. So in ours, the conditional and the contrapositive were both true. They are equivalent statements. The converse and the inverse were both false. They are equivalent statements. So we're going to do one last thing. If the figure is a square, then the figure is a quadrilateral. So I want you to take this statement on your own and do 4 things for me before class. 1. Identify the hypothesis and the conclusion. 2. Write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive for the original conditional. Write them verbally using the words and then in terms of P and Q. So just like I did on the big chart. Number 3, identify the truth value of each statement. And 4, if a statement is false, give a counter example. So you have 4 things to do before class. Make sure it's nice and neat, and I will see you in class.